Well, hey there, students, and welcome to the presentation on the Sepoy Rebellion, or the First Indian Revolution, take your pick, and also the formation of the British Raj. There's only one essential question for this presentation, and that is, why was the Sepoy uprising or rebellion or revolution significant? And I'm going to caution you that I know that this presentation is too Eurocentric because the eyewitness accounts are from Europeans. But just keep that in mind because the information is solid and they do talk a lot about the horror of the event. Unfortunately, they don't tell you anything about the horror the Indians must have experienced. Now, by the mid-19th century, Britain had successfully replaced the Mughals as the dominant force in India. The British East India Company was the governing force of this massive nation. The primary goal of the East India Company was to maximize profits. It wasn't to protect the rights of Indians. Even though Britain was in a powerful position, they were dwarfed by the native population. India, in the 19th century, 1850, had a population of 250 million people. The British civilians numbered only 125,000. The British Army numbered only 250,000, and only 43,000 of those soldiers were actually from Britain. The majority were native soldiers called sepoys. The sepoys were like India herself, mostly Hindu, but with a sizable Muslim minority. The British, feeling anxious and outnumbered, did something that caused great antipathy among Indians. They retreated to these settlements, these heavily fortified settlements called cantonments. These were compounds where privileged British could retreat and live a pampered existence amongst incredible poverty among most Indians. These settlements caused tremendous animosity among many Indians. Many British were also sincerely moved by Christianity's Great Commission to spread the gospel. Here was a nation of 250 million souls. It was a wonderful opportunity to expand Christendom. It turned out to be a tragic example, however, of limited perspective. You see, the Hindus had endured nearly a millennia of Islamic conversion attempts, and the thought of now enduring Christian evangelism was too much for many. The final straw was the introduction of the new Enfield Rifle. This advanced marvel of the Industrial Revolution used cartridges lubricated with animal fat. Rumors spread like wildfire amongst the sepoys. The Muslim soldiers were convinced they were greased with pig fat, a blasphemous animal to Muslims. Hindu soldiers believed the cartridges were greased with the fat of cows, a sacred animal to Hindus. The sepoys felt disrespected, and they were convinced that the introduction of these cartridges was just one step down the road of forced conversion to Christianity. In March of 1857, Mangal Pandey, a humble sepoy soldier, acted upon this rage. John Brown, in the article The Indian Rebellion of 1857, describes the incident as such. On March 29th, an incident took place involving an inflamed sepoy of the 34th Native Infantry named Mangal Pandey. The colonel commanding the regiment, S.G. Wheeler, was a so-called New Light, a born-again Christian who frequently belabored his troops with unwanted sermons. On the parade ground at Barrack Poré, Pandey suddenly broke rank, calling on his comrades to rise up and resist the new cartridges. General Hearsay rode up to Pandey and defied him to shoot. The badly rattled soldier shot himself instead. Pandey survived his suicide attempt, only to be hanged for mutiny 10 days later. His name would become the generic title given by the British to all subsequent Indian mutineers, Pandeys. A couple weeks later in April, in the city of Meerut, the rebellion begins. What was disturbing from the onset was the level of violence the sepoys directed toward British civilians. There was no concern for slaughtering helpless women and children. The zenith of this slaughter took place during the months of June and July in the city of Kanpur, now Kanpur. The sepoys mercilessly killed 120 British civilians, including many children. Here's the way 17-year-old survivor Amy Horn describes the carnage. Now, this was after many had been killed in a small compound. They were given leeway to escape, but something dastardly happened at the river's edge. Here's the way Amy describes it. Battered and bruised like ships that come into port after being buffeted by storms, babbled the children. Others had vacant stares in their eyes, as if they beheld visions of the future. Many a little child was raving mad. You have to understand, by this point, they'd been stuck in a compound for a number of days in the summer heat, and many were starving or dying of dehydration. It was pitiful to see their singular behavior. They reached the river at the village called Satichara. The water was at midsummer low point. Heaps of wood, sodden vegetation, and an occasional cadaver bumped into the banks. 24 bamboo boats, 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, were pulled up to the shore for the boarding parties. The fittest amongst the men waded into the river, carrying the women and children and sick and wounded, and loaded them into the boats. Native boatmen watched silently, as did dozens of mutineers lining both banks of the river. When the majority of British had climbed aboard the boats, the boatmen suddenly jumped overboard and thrashed toward the shore. Shouting for them to return to the boats, the British opened fire with what few weapons they had. Terrible move. Simultaneously, the mutineers on the riverbanks began shooting back with muskets and cannon loaded with grape shot. More and more sepoys poured from their hiding places in the village and unloaded a withering fire on the people in the boats. Coal embers secreted in the thatched roofs in the vessels ignited as well, immolating the clothes and bedding of the sick and wounded lying in the hulls. As the boats began to sink, the dazed survivors scrambled over the sides and either struggled blindly toward the shore or cringed behind the smoldering wrecks in the shallow water. Bodies quickly littered the river, and women crouched down in the bloody water in a vain attempt to save themselves and the children. Babies floated downstream. Some of the men tried to push the boats into midstream to get away, but Indian cavalrymen rode their horses into the river, slashing with their sabers at the dwindling number of survivors. Only one boat escaped, rudderless and oarless, with 2 English officers and 2 Irish privates on board to tell the tale. When the British finally did reinforce its beleaguered soldiers at Kanpur, they went on a vengeful killing spree. Captain Garnet Wolseley, who saw firsthand the compound at Kanpur, remembered years later, and this is very hard to listen to, folks, a more sickening, a more maddening sight no Englishman has ever looked upon. Upon entering the blood-stained rooms, the heart seemed to stop. The horror of the scene was appalling and called up our worst angry passions. It woke in us, the countrymen of these helpless victims, a fiendish craving for the blood of the cowardly murderers. The idea that a native should have dared put his hands on an Englishman was too much. An all-observing craving for ruthless vengeance. That most unchristian of passions was deep in our hearts. But an English bishop visited the scene of butchery. When I saw it, I verily believe that he would have buckled on a sword. The furious British soldiers at Kanpur rounded up all suspected mutineers and subjected them to deliberate degradation before they flogged them, before hanging them from hastily improvised gallows. Hindu captives were forced to eat beef, and Muslims were forced to eat pork. Those who refused simply had the offensive meat stuffed down their throats. The British forced other prisoners to lick up the blood from the compound floor where the helpless women and children had been slaughtered. High-caste Brahmins were executed by low-caste street sweepers, whose merest touch was supposed to send Brahmins into a series of hideous reincarnations as snakes and toads. Still other prisoners were tied to the mouths of cannon and blown to pieces. Supposedly this was a relatively painless form of death, Methodist missionary William Butler said it was intended mainly to further humiliate the Hindu rebels, who believed that the dissipation of mortal remains of a man thus executed would necessarily expose the disembodied ghost to a wandering, indefinite condition in the other world, which they regarded as dreadful. In the end of this killing orgy, the Sepoy Rebellion resulted in the death of 53,000 people. 13,000 of these 53,000 were British, so the vast majority, 40 grand, were Indian. The accounts that I gave you were British accounts, American accounts of what took place. But you can imagine that the Indian accounts would be just as horrific, and there were probably more of them. But the most significant result of the conflict, and by all accounts it's a positive result, was the demise of the British East India Company. The British government just took over. From 1858 to 1947, this era of British rule of India would be referred to as the British Raj. India would be governed by the British Crown. The British Crown had lots of interests, not just profit, and they were determined to rule India more justly and make certain that no such bloodshed ever erupted again.